On the 12th of September 1942, the German submarine U-156 was patrolling the waters off the West African coast, hunting for Allied shipping in one of the war's most remote theaters. Her commander was Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein, a 34-year-old officer with a reputation for both competence and humanity, qualities that did not always coexist in the brutal calculus of submarine warfare. Hartenstein had already sunk 19 ships during his career, sending tens of thousands of tons of Allied cargo to the bottom. He was a professional, doing a professional's job, operating under rules of engagement that prioritized military efficiency above all else. In a few hours, those rules would force him into an impossible choice, and the consequences would reshape the ethics of undersea combat for the remainder of the war. The target that appeared in Hartenstein's periscope that evening was the RMS Laconia, a 20,000-ton Cunard liner that had been converted for war service as a troopship and prisoner transport. She was traveling from Suez to Britain via the Cape of Good Hope, carrying a human cargo of extraordinary diversity: 268 British crew members, 80 civilians including women and children, 268 British soldiers, 160 Polish soldiers serving as guards, and 1,800 Italian prisoners of war captured during the North African campaign. In total, nearly 2,800 souls were aboard, most of them unaware that a German submarine was watching from below. Hartenstein made his decision based on the information available to him, which was incomplete. He saw a large ship traveling alone, blacked out, following a zigzag course, all indicators of a legitimate military target. He could not know about the Italian prisoners, allies of Germany, who were being transported to captivity in Britain. He could not know about the women and children, whose presence on a vessel in a combat zone was unusual, but not unprecedented. He saw what appeared to be an enemy troopship, and he did what submarine commanders were trained to do. At 8:10 in the evening, U-156 fired 2 torpedoes. Both struck home. The Laconia began to die immediately. The explosions tore open her hull below the waterline, flooding compartments faster than the pumps could handle. The ship listed heavily, making the deployment of lifeboats on one side nearly impossible. In the holds below decks, the Italian prisoners found themselves trapped behind locked hatches, their Polish guards either unable or unwilling to release them as water poured in. Panic spread through the vessel. Men fought for places in lifeboats. Some jumped into the sea without life jackets, preferring the chance of drowning to the certainty of going down with the ship. Within 20 minutes, Laconia was clearly doomed. Hartenstein, observing through his periscope, initially felt the satisfaction of a successful attack. Then he began to hear something that changed everything. Voices carried across the water, audible even through the submarine's hull, and some of those voices were screaming in Italian. Hartenstein surfaced to investigate and found himself confronting a scene of horror that no amount of professional detachment could rationalize away. The water around the sinking liner was filled with struggling survivors, and many of them were shouting for help in the language of Germany's closest ally. The discovery placed Hartenstein in an unprecedented situation. International law, specifically the London Submarine Protocol of 1936, required that warships, including submarines, provide for the safety of merchant vessel crews and passengers before sinking their ships. Germany had signed this protocol, though the realities of submarine warfare made compliance essentially impossible. A surfaced U-boat was vulnerable to aircraft and warships. Stopping to rescue survivors invited destruction. The standard practice followed by all belligerents was to attack submerged and leave the aftermath to others. Hartenstein had followed this practice throughout his career. Now, confronted with hundreds of drowning Italians, he found he could not continue. What followed was one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the war, remarkable precisely because it violated every principle of military self-preservation that submarine commanders were taught to follow. Hartenstein ordered U-156 to surface fully and began taking survivors aboard. He radioed his headquarters, informing Admiral Dönitz of the situation and requesting assistance. He broadcast an open message on the international distress frequency, announcing his position and his intention to rescue survivors, promising not to attack any vessel that came to assist. He draped the submarine's deck with makeshift Red Cross flags fashioned from sheets, hoping to signal his humanitarian intent to any aircraft that might appear. The response from German Naval Command was swift but complicated. Dönitz recognized the moral dimensions of Hartenstein's situation, but he also recognized the military risks. Ordering a submarine to remain surfaced in enemy waters, surrounded by survivors who could not be accommodated below decks, was an invitation to disaster. Nevertheless, he dispatched additional U-boats to the scene and arranged for Vichy French warships from the nearby port of Dakar to assist with the rescue. For the next several days, an improvised flotilla of former enemies would work together to save lives, creating a moment of humanity in the midst of a war defined by inhumanity. U-156 was soon joined by U-506 and U-507, their commanders equally willing to risk their boats and crews for the rescue operation. The scene that developed around the submarines was surreal. German sailors hauled British, Polish, and Italian survivors from the water, providing them with food, water, and medical attention. The submarine's decks became crowded with exhausted refugees, some of them wounded, all of them traumatized by their ordeal. Below decks, every available space was filled with survivors, including the torpedo rooms, where men who had been trying to kill each other days earlier now shared quarters in uneasy proximity. The submarines began towing lifeboats that could not be accommodated aboard, creating unwieldy convoys that moved slowly toward the rendezvous point with the Vichy French ships. Hartenstein continued to broadcast his position and intentions, trusting that the international community would respect his humanitarian mission. For 2 days, the operation proceeded without interference. It appeared that, for once, the imperatives of mercy would override the imperatives of war. Then came the aircraft. On the morning of September 16th, an American B-24 Liberator bomber, operating from a secret base on Ascension Island, appeared overhead. The pilot, Lieutenant James Harden, observed the surface submarines, the lifeboats in tow, the survivors crowding every available surface, and the Red Cross flags displayed on the decks. He reported the situation to his base and was ordered to attack. The reasoning, as later reconstructed, was that the submarines were legitimate military targets, regardless of what they appeared to be doing, and that the rescue operation might be a ruse designed to protect the U-boats from attack. Harden made several passes over the submarines, and accounts differ about what happened next. Some witnesses reported that the aircraft dropped bombs on the submarines themselves, endangering both the German crews and the survivors they were protecting. Others recalled that the bombs fell among the lifeboats, killing people who had already survived the sinking of the Laconia. The submarines crash-dived to escape, a maneuver that caused many survivors on deck to be swept into the sea. The lifeboats, suddenly abandoned, were left to drift without protection or guidance. The humanitarian rescue had been transformed in moments into a secondary massacre. The attack did not sink any of the submarines, but it killed an unknown number of survivors and shattered the fragile trust that had made the rescue operation possible. Hartenstein, surfacing after the aircraft departed, was faced with a changed situation. The agreement, implicit but seemingly understood, that humanitarian activities would be respected, had been violated. His submarine had been attacked while displaying Red Cross markings, while clearly engaged in rescue operations, while broadcasting his peaceful intentions on open frequencies. The laws of war, such as they were, had proven to be worth nothing. Dönitz received reports of the attack with cold fury. He had authorized the rescue operation against his better judgment, convinced by Hartenstein's arguments and his own sense of obligation to Germany's Italian allies. Now his submarines had been bombed while performing an act of mercy, his crews endangered, his judgment questioned. The incident confirmed what he had long suspected, that the rules of war, as written in peacetime treaties, had no relevance to the actual conduct of submarine operations. The Allies would attack German submarines whenever and wherever they found them, regardless of circumstances. Any commander who forgot this reality was inviting destruction. 3 days after the Ascension Island attack, on September 17, 1942, Dönitz issued what would become known as the Laconia Order. The directive was brief and unambiguous. All attempts to rescue the crews of sunken ships were forbidden, including picking up survivors, righting capsized lifeboats, and providing food or water to those in the water. Only the rescue of ships' captains and chief engineers was permitted, and only when their capture might yield valuable intelligence. Submarine commanders were reminded that the survival of their boats and crews must take absolute priority. The enemy, Dönitz wrote, was not concerned with humanitarian considerations when attacking submarines, and Germany could not afford to be more scrupulous. The order was controversial from the moment it was issued, and it would become even more controversial after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors cited the Laconia Order as evidence of war crimes, arguing that it effectively instructed German submarine commanders to murder survivors. Dönitz defended himself by pointing to the exact wording of the directive, which prohibited rescue operations but did not explicitly order killing. He also pointed to the circumstances that had prompted the order, the attack on submarines engaged in humanitarian rescue, arguing that the Allies had forfeited any right to expect German compliance with conventions they themselves had violated. The legal arguments continue to this day, but the practical effect of the Laconia Order was clear and immediate. German submarine commanders, who had occasionally rescued survivors or provided them with assistance before September 1942, now had explicit orders forbidding such actions. The marginal humanity that had survived in the U-boat war, a captain pointing survivors toward land, a crew throwing provisions to men in the water, was eliminated by official decree. The war beneath the waves became colder, more absolute, less willing to acknowledge that the enemy was human. The moral dimensions of this transformation deserve careful consideration. Before the Laconia incident, submarine warfare existed in a gray zone between military necessity and humanitarian obligation. Commanders made individual decisions based on circumstances, sometimes choosing mercy when it seemed safe, other times passing by survivors when rescue seemed impossible. The Laconia Order removed this discretion, replacing individual judgment with institutional policy. Mercy was no longer an option to be weighed. It was a violation of orders. Critics of Dönitz argue that he could have responded to the Ascension Island attack differently. He could have protested through diplomatic channels, demanded investigations, sought assurances that future rescue operations would be protected. Instead, he chose to eliminate rescue operations entirely, a response that served German military interests, but abandoned any pretense of humanitarian concern. The Laconia Order, in this reading, was not a necessary adaptation to enemy behavior, but an excuse to formalize practices that German submarines had often followed anyway. Defenders of Dönitz make the opposite argument. The realities of submarine warfare, they contend, had always made rescue operations impractical and dangerous. The Laconia incident demonstrated that even good faith attempts at mercy would be punished rather than rewarded. By issuing the order, Dönitz was merely acknowledging what the Allies had already made clear through their actions, that submarine warfare was a fight to the death, with no quarter given or expected. The fault lay not with Germany for adapting to these conditions, but with the Allies for creating them. The truth, as often happens in war, was probably somewhere between these positions. The Laconia Order was both a response to genuine provocation and an extension of trends that predated the incident. German submarines had rarely engaged in systematic rescue operations even before September 1942. The physical limitations of the boats and the tactical requirements of the campaign made such operations difficult under any circumstances. What the order changed was the moral framework within which commanders operated. Before Laconia, mercy was discouraged but not forbidden. After Laconia, it was explicitly prohibited. For Hartenstein himself, the aftermath of the incident was anticlimactic. He continued to command U-156, conducting additional patrols in the Atlantic and Caribbean. His rescue attempt was neither punished nor rewarded by his superiors. It was simply filed away as an anomaly, a deviation from standard practice that would not be repeated. He was killed in March 1943 when U-156 was sunk by American aircraft near Barbados. He was 35 years old. The men who survived the Laconia, both those he rescued and those who were abandoned after the air attack, would remember him as a complex figure, an enemy who had become a savior, a warrior who had chosen mercy, a man whose compassion was answered with bombs. The broader legacy of the Laconia incident extends far beyond the specific events of September 1942. The case raised questions about the laws of war that remain unresolved today. What obligations do combatants have toward civilians and prisoners caught in military operations? What happens when humanitarian actions expose military forces to attack? How should courts judge decisions made under conditions of extreme stress and imperfect information? The Nuremberg tribunal that considered these questions in relation to Dönitz ultimately acquitted him of the charge that the Laconia Order constituted a war crime, though it convicted him on other counts related to unrestricted submarine warfare. The American role in the incident has received less scrutiny than it perhaps deserves. The decision to attack submarines visibly engaged in rescue operations, displaying Red Cross markings and broadcasting humanitarian intentions, was made at multiple levels of command. The pilot who dropped the bombs was following orders. Those orders came from officers who knew at least something about what the submarines were doing. The attack was not an accident or a case of mistaken identity. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize military objectives over humanitarian considerations, exactly the calculation that Dönitz would later be accused of making. The survivors of the Laconia, those who were eventually rescued by Vichy French ships after the submarines withdrew, carried memories of the incident for the rest of their lives. British sailors remembered German submariners pulling them from the water, sharing rations, treating their wounds. Italian prisoners remembered the terror of being trapped below decks as the ship sank, then the relief of rescue, then the horror of the air attack that killed some of their fellow survivors. Polish guards remembered the chaos and confusion, the impossible choices made in moments of crisis. Each group had its own perspective on what had happened and what it meant. The wreck of the Laconia lies in deep water off the West African coast, too deep for conventional diving. She went down with over 1,500 of her passengers and crew, most of them Italian prisoners who never escaped the holds. It was one of the largest losses of life in a single sinking during the Battle of the Atlantic, yet it is less remembered than many smaller disasters. Perhaps this is because the story is so complicated, so resistant to simple narratives of good and evil. The Germans were both killers and rescuers. The Allies were both victims and aggressors. The Italians were prisoners who became casualties of a war they had already lost. The neat categories of wartime propaganda cannot accommodate such complexity. What remains certain is that the Laconia incident changed the nature of submarine warfare permanently. Before September 1942, there was at least the possibility of mercy at sea, however rarely it was exercised. After the Laconia Order, that possibility was officially foreclosed. The submarines of all nations, for the Allies adopted similar policies, if less explicitly, became pure killing machines, instruments of destruction with no accommodation for humanitarian concerns. The cold logic of total war, which recognized no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, which saw every ship and every sailor as legitimate targets, had triumphed completely. The ocean where these events unfolded keeps no memorial. The waters off West Africa are traveled today by cargo ships and tankers, following routes not so different from those the Laconia sailed. Occasionally, research vessels pass over the area where the submarines surfaced, where the survivors struggled, where the bombs fell on people who had already nearly died. The sea gives no sign of what happened there, no marker for the drowned, no monument to the moment when mercy was attempted and rejected. Only the records remain, the logbooks and testimonies, the orders and court transcripts, to remind us that once, in the middle of a terrible war, men tried to do the right thing and were punished for it. Werner Hartenstein made a choice on the night of September 12, 1942. He could have sailed away, leaving the survivors to their fate, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he surfaced, broadcast his position, and began pulling enemies from the water. His reward was an air attack on his submarine and an order from his commander, forbidding any repetition of his actions. The message was clear, delivered by both sides in their different ways. Mercy has no place in modern war. Hartenstein received that message, but he had already given his answer, there in the darkness of the Atlantic, surrounded by drowning men who spoke the wrong languages, but were drowning just the same. He chose to save them anyway, and the war became a little colder when his example was forbidden. The Laconia Order remained in effect until the end of the war. No German submarine commander was punished for following it, and no survivor was rescued because of humanitarian impulses that the order prohibited. The men who died in the water after torpedo attacks, British, American, Norwegian, Greek, sailors of a dozen nations, died alone, without hope of rescue from the submarines that killed them. This was the legacy of September 1942, not the rescue that Hartenstein attempted, but the prohibition that followed, a final acknowledgement that the war at sea had become a war without quarter, fought by men in steel tubes who could not afford the luxury of compassion.